Many people will agree that this sort of thing happens on occasion, but as a rule, we're reluctant to think it happens a lot, or at least that it happens a lot to us in particular. We especially tend to think that our most vivid memories, precisely because they're vivid, are the most reliable. It turns out to not be true either. About 40 years ago, some psychologists did think it was true. A very famous article published by psychologists Roger Brown and James Kulik in 1977 argued that when we experience a highly unexpected emotional and consequential event, we have a special memory mechanism that stores it indelibly on the brain. It's almost as if the mind says, take a picture of this, and it does so. Brown and Kulik called these flashbulb memories. When you recall such memories, they claimed, your mind says, now print, and the memory flashes back as clear as day and as accurately as when you first experienced it. That certainly seems true to our experience. Probably every one of us remembers where we were when we heard about the attacks on the World Trade Center on September 11th, 2001. We remember where we heard the news, how we heard it, whom we were with when we heard it, how we first reacted to it, and so on. It's a flashbulb memory. If such memories exist and they are accurate, that might be worthwhile knowing when thinking about memories of Jesus. What could be more flashbulb than seeing a man walk on water, or feed the multitudes with a few loaves, or heal a man born blind, or rise from the dead? There has been an intense research on flashbulb since Brown and Kulik first proposed the phenomenon, however, and their original view appears to be wrong. Yes, such memories are highly vivid, but just because a memory is especially vivid does not mean that it is especially accurate. Many of us have a hard time believing that, at least when it comes to our own vivid memories, but it is true and has been shown repeatedly. Psychologists can be very clear about how they go about showing such things, or very clever, rather. A classic study, which set the stage for much research to come, was done 9 years after Brown and Kulig's initial publication. It was undertaken by psychologists Ulrich Neisser and Nicole Harsh, who were perceptive enough to realize that a personal and national disaster could be important for realizing how memory works. The day after the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded on January 28th, 1986, they gave 106 students in a psychology class at Emory University a questionnaire asking about their personal circumstances when they heard the news. A year and a half later, in the fall of 1988, they tracked down 44 of these students and gave them the same questionnaire. A half year later, in spring 1989, they interviewed 40 of these 44 about the event. The findings were startling but very telling. To begin with, 75% of those who took the second questionnaire were certain that they had never taken the first one. That was obviously wrong. In terms of what was being asked, there were questions about where they were when they heard the news, what time of day it was, what they were doing at the time, whom they learned it from, and so on. 7 questions altogether. 25% of the participants got every single answer wrong on the second questionnaire, even though their memories were vivid and they were highly confident in their answers. Another 50% got only 2 of the 7 questions correct. Only 3 of the 44 got all the answers right the second time. And even in those cases, there were mistakes in some of the details. When the participants' confidence in their answers was ranked in relation to their accuracy, there was no relation between confidence and accuracy at all in 42 of the 44 instances. You might think, or at least I did, that after the second questionnaire, when the students were shown the original answers that they had filled out just a day after the explosion, they would realize that they had since then misremembered and they would revive their original memories. This decidedly did not happen. Instead, when confronted with evidence of what really took place, they consistently denied it and said that their present memories were the correct ones. In the words of the researchers, No one who had given an incorrect account in the interview even pretended that they now recalled what was started or what was stated on the original record. As far as we can tell, the original memories are just gone. This is a sobering point indeed. All of us have vivid memories of the past. These are the memories we trust the most. We're absolutely certain it happened the way we remember. Why else would it be vivid? The answer is that it might be vivid because we have replayed the event in our memory time and time again in the same wrong way. So now that's how we remember it vividly. The final conclusion, that nicer and harsh draw, is worth stressing that, quote, our data leave no doubt that vivid and confident flashbulb recollections can be mistaken. When this happens, the original memories seem to have disappeared entirely. Or, as a very recent study by psychologists Jennifer Tallarico and David Rubin has shown, flashbulb memories are distinguished from original memories by their vividness and the confidence with which they are held. There is little evidence that they are reliably different from ordinary autobiographical memories in accuracy, consistency, or longevity. This may be important when thinking about the eyewitness recollections of what they saw Jesus do. If what Jesus did was spectacular and some of the followers later had vivid memories of his activities, would that guarantee that their memories were accurate? The answer is no, in case you didn't fucking know. But let's keep going. Remembering the gist. Let me make a point that may not be clear from what I've said so far about the psychology of memory, in stressing the fact, which appears to be a fact, that memories are always constructed and therefore prone to error, even when they're quite vivid. I'm decidedly not saying that all of our memories are faulty or wrong. Most of the time, we remember pretty well, at least in broad outline. Presumably, so too did eyewitnesses to the life of Jesus, as did the person who heard a story from an eyewitness may well have remembered in broad outline what he was told. And the person who heard a story from a neighbor whose cousin was married to a man whose father told him a story that he heard from a business associate whose wife once knew someone who was married to an eyewitness. Probably in the latter case, which, as far fetched as it sounds, may be pretty close to how most people were hearing stories about Jesus. A lot more would have been changed than in the case of an eyewitness telling someone the day after he saw something happen. But my basic point here is that despite the faults of memory, we do obviously remember a lot of things, and the fundamental memories themselves can often be right. This is a commonplace in the psychological study of memory. We tend to remember the gist of an experience pretty well, even if the details get messed up. You may not remember correctly where, when, with whom, or how you heard about the Challenger explosion, or the results of the O.J. Simpson trial, or even the attacks of the 9/11 World Trade Center. But you do remember that you heard about the events, and you remember that they happened. As we'll see, this is an important point because there are gist memories of Jesus recorded in the New Testament Gospels that are almost certainly accurate. At the same time, there are a lot of details, and in fact, entire episodes, that are almost certainly not accurate. These are memories of things that didn't actually happen. They are distorted memories. Still, many of the broad outlines that are narrated in the Gospels certainly did happen. Much of the gist is correct. One big question, then, is just how broad does a memory have to be in order to be considered a gist memory? Different scholars may have different views about that. A famous example can demonstrate my point. There's a much cited study done of both detailed and gist memories of a person who claimed to have and was generally conceded to have a very good memory. John Dean. He was White House counsel to Richard Nixon from July 1970 to April 1973. During the Watergate hearings, Dean testified in detail about dozens of specific conversations he had during the White House cover up. In the course of the hearings, he was asked how he could possibly remember such things. He claimed to have a good memory in general, but he also indicated that he had used later newspaper clippings about events in the White House to refresh his memory and to place himself back in the context of the events that were described. It was after he publicly described his conversations with Nixon that the White House tapes were discovered. With this new evidence of what was actually said on each occasion, one could look carefully at what Dean had earlier remembered as having been said to see if he recalled both the gist and the details correctly. Well, that's exactly what the previously mentioned Ulrich Neisser did in an intriguing article called John Dean's Memory, a Case Study. Neisser examined two specific conversations that took place in the Oval Office, one on September 15th, 1972, and the other on March 21st, 1973. By comparing the transcript of Dean's testimony with the actual recordings of the conversations, the findings were striking. Even when he was not elevating his own role and position as he tended to do, Dean got things wrong. Lots of things wrong, even big things. For example, the hearing that involved the September 15 conversation occurred 9 months later. The contrast between what Dean claimed was said and what was really said was sharp and striking. Here's Neisser's words, quote, "Comparison with the transcript shows that hardly a word of Dean's account is true. Nixon did not say any of the things attributed to him here, nor had Dean himself said the things he later describes himself as saying. His account is plausible, but entirely incorrect. Dean cannot be said to have reported the gist of the opening remarks. No count of idea units or comparison of structure would produce a score much above zero." It should be stressed that Neisser does not think Dean was lying about what happened in the conversation to make himself look good. The conversation that really happened and the one he described as happening were both highly incriminating. So why is there a difference between what he said was said and what was really said? Neisser argues that it's all about filling in the gaps, the problem I mentioned earlier with respect to F.C. Bartlett. Dean was pulling from different parts of his brain the traces of what had occurred on the occasion, and his mind unconsciously filled in the gaps. Thus, he remembered what was said when he walked into the Oval Office based on the kinds of things that typically were said when he walked into the Oval Office. In fact, whereas there may have only been said on other occasions, they weren't on this one. Or he might have recalled how his conversations with Nixon typically began and thought that that was the case here also, even though it wasn't. Moreover, almost certainly, whether intentionally or subconsciously, he was doing what all of us do a lot of the time. He was inflating his own role in and position in the conversation. What his testimony really describes is not the September 15 meeting itself, but his fantasy of it. The meeting as it should have been, so to speak. By June, this fantasy had become the way Dean remembered the meeting. Neisser sums up his findings like this, quote, "It is clear that Dean's account of the opening of the September 15 conversation is wrong both as to the words and the gist. Moreover, cross-examination did not reveal his errors as clearly as one might have hoped. Dean came across as a man who has a good memory for gist with an occasional literal word stuck in, like a raisin in a pudding. He was not such a man. And so, whether Dean had a decent gist memory probably depends on how broadly one defines gist. He knew he had a conversation with Nixon. He knew what the topics were. Nonetheless, he appears not to have known what was actually said either by Nixon or himself. In this instance, we're talking about an extraordinarily intelligent and educated man with a fine memory trying to recall conversations from 9 months before. Well, what would happen if we were dealing with more ordinary people with average memories trying to recall what someone said maybe 2 years ago, or 20, or 40, or 2000? Just saying. Try it yourself. Pick a conversation that you had 2 years ago with somebody, a teacher, a pastor, a boss, a friend. Do you remember what you said word for word? Even if you think you do, is there any actual evidence that you do? It's important to emphasize what experts have actually learned about memories and distorted memories. Leading memory expert Elizabeth Loftus and her colleague Catherine Ketchum reflect on this issue. Quote, are we aware of our mind's distortions of our past experiences? In most cases, the answer is no. As time goes by and the memories gradually change, we become convinced that what we saw or said or did is what we remember. These comments are dealing with just our own personal memories. What about a report by someone else of a conversation that a third person had written long afterward? What are the chances that it will be accurate, word for word? Or even better, what about a report written by someone who had heard about the conversation from someone who was friends with a man whose brother's wife had a cousin who happened to be there? A report written, say, several decades after the fact. Is it likely to record the exact words? In fact, is it likely to remember precisely even the gist or the topics? Jesus' Sermon on the Mount in Matthew's chapters 5 through 7 was recorded about 50 years after he would have delivered the sermon. But can we assume he delivered it? If he did so, did he speak the specific words now found in the sermon while sitting on a mountain addressing the crowds? On that occasion, did he really say, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven, and beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves? And everyone who hears these words of mine and does them will be like a wise man who built his house on a rock. Or did he just say or did he just say things sort of like that on the occasion? Or did he say something sort of like that on another occasion or any occasion at all? Which is the gist and which is the detail? Or what about episodes from Jesus' life recorded, say, 40 years later? Was Jesus crucified between two robbers who mocked him before he died 6 hours later? Are those details correct or is the gist correct? But what is the gist? Is it that Jesus was crucified with two robbers? Is it that Jesus was crucified? Is it that Jesus died? Gist memories of Jesus' death. One of my purposes in this book is to examine later traditions about Jesus recorded in our Gospels, written between 40 and 65 years after his death. Fuck niggas. To see if any of them include distorted memories, either in whole or in part. In this chapter, I will focus on traditions involving the death of Jesus. In the next chapter, after exploring the question of whether oral cultures are likely to remember the past more accurately than literary ones, I will explore traditions involving the earlier life and ministry of Jesus. I want to begin with stories surrounding Jesus' last days and hours because these were the most remembered parts of his life. This can be seen simply by considering the amount of space devoted to this period in the Gospels. The Gospel of Mark devotes 10 chapters to Jesus' public ministry in Galilee and fully 6 to his last week, days, and hours in Jerusalem. The Gospel of John covers the more than a 2-year public ministry of Jesus in 11 chapters, but the final week of his life in 10. Nearly all critical scholars would agree that some gist memories of Jesus' last week, as recorded in the Gospels, are almost certainly accurate. These memories are recorded independently in different sources and do not appear to be remembered in any prejudicial way. For example, because they represent episodes of Jesus' life that Christians particularly would have wanted to say happened for their own later benefit. Moreover, there is nothing inherently implausible about them. Among these memories would be the following. In the last week of Jesus' life, he and a group of his followers left Galilee to go to Jerusalem for the annual Passover. When they arrived, Jesus engaged in some kind of disruptive activity in the temple to protest what was being done there by those selling sacrificial animals and exchanging money. Jesus spent the week in Jerusalem preaching his message about the coming kingdom of God. Possibly he started to attract people to that message. The ruling authorities, either Jewish or Roman or both, feared that Jesus' message could lead to trouble and decided to have him arrested. One of Jesus' disciples, Judas Iscariot, cooperated with these authorities. After it was dark, following a final meal, probably for the Passover, with his followers, Jesus was arrested in a garden in the presence of his disciples. He spent the night in custody. The next morning, he was brought before the governor Pontius Pilate on the charge that he was calling himself King of the Jews. Pilate found him guilty of the charge and ordered him to be executed, and Jesus was immediately taken off and crucified along with two other criminals. On one level, this is a lot of information, and it's somewhat comforting to know that at least this much gist memory appears to be historical. But most of us are not satisfied with simply a broad outline. We want to know more. For example, when Jesus was found guilty of a capital offense, what were the reasons? Was he really calling himself the King of the Jews? What did that mean? Was he a violent revolutionary who wanted to raise an army against Rome and install himself as a king? Was he a threat to the social order by promoting equality instead of social hierarchy and saw himself as a kind of metaphorical king? Was he preaching an apocalyptic message of the coming destruction of the ruling powers that would result in a new kingdom in which he would rule? Was it something else? Does it matter? For most of us, it matters, and we are incurably interested in more of the details about all the events surrounding Jesus' last days and hours. When he came to Jerusalem for the Passover, did he ride into the city on a donkey as Jewish people lined the streets, hailing him as the coming Messiah? When he caused a disturbance in the temple, did he shut down the entire temple cult? When he was arrested in the garden, did his followers draw swords and try to defend him? When he was put on trial before Pontius Pilate, did Pontius declare him innocent, but order him to be executed only because the Jewish authorities forced him to do so? Did Pilate offer to set Jesus free, only to have the Jewish crowd insist that he release for them instead a man named Barabbas, who was scheduled for execution for insurrection? When Jesus was crucified, did the curtain in the temple rip in half? These are just some of the questions we have. We have many, many more when dealing with the memories recorded in the Gospels. We ultimately would like to know about each and every detail. Are they accurate? In what follows, I do not plan to cover all the details that would require several large volumes. I have instead decided to pick a number of important episodes, the ones just mentioned, that I think embody either wholesale distorted memories or distorted details of a memory that is true in gist. An illustration of the method, Jesus' trial before Pilate. The biggest question we have to deal with at the outset is also the most obvious one. How do we know if a memory of Jesus as recorded in the Gospels is accurate? By which I mean that it is something that in fact did not actually take place. My analyses in this chapter and the next will be based on a premise that it is indeed possible to uncover a distorted collection of Jesus' life, and that it can be done in one of two ways. On one hand, there are some memories of the same event from the life of Jesus that are at odds with another. This happens, for example, when different gospels tell different versions of the same incident. It is true that sometimes different versions of an event are simply looking at the same thing, but in a different way. But sometimes the differences are stark enough, or even contradictory, that it's clear that they both or all can't be true to what actually happened. When that is the case, then one or more of the descriptions cannot be historically accurate and represent somebody's distorted memory. On the other hand, there are some descriptions of past events that are simply implausible, utterly beyond what seems likely. These, of course, have to be argued and explained on a case-by-case basis. Still, there are such descriptions in our accounts, both of Jesus' life and of his death. Since these are historically implausible episodes, they too would appear to represent distorted memories. These distorted memories are important, I will argue, not only for knowing as best we can what really happened in Jesus' life, although certainly that, but also for knowing what his later followers thought was really important about his life, presumably because their own present contexts were influencing how they remembered him in the ways they did. I'll try to illustrate both ways of detecting distorted memories by picking a single example that contains both features. Some aspects of the description differ from one gospel account to the other, and several other aspects are simply implausible. The example involves Jesus' trial before Pilate, as described in all four of our canonical gospels. As I have indicated, most critical scholars would agree that in very broad outline, the gospel accounts represent a true gist memory. During a Passover festival, Jesus was brought before the governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate, found guilty for calling himself king of the Jews in order to be crucified. That, in broad outline, this is probably a true memory of the event, is suggested by various factors. It is beyond reasonable doubt that Jesus was crucified. Crucifixion was a Roman form of execution. The Romans appear to have reserved the right of capital punishment to themselves. The governor would have been the one responsible for issuing an order of execution. We know that Pontius Pilate was the governor at that time, and we know that typically the governor was in Jerusalem during the Passover feast. If you add it all up, the gist memory seems completely plausible. What is striking is how differently the four Gospels narrate Jesus' trial. I will not go into all the details here, but we'll focus on two features of the accounts: the portrayal of Pilate on one hand, and the portrayal of the Jewish leaders and or crowds on the other. In our earliest Gospel, Mark, Jesus is brought by the Jewish authorities to Pilate, who asks him if he is the king of the Jews. Jesus replies in two words in Greek. The Jewish leaders level many charges against Jesus, but to Pilate's amazement, Jesus does not reply to them. We are told that it was Pilate's custom to release one prisoner to the Jewish crowd in honor of the Passover holiday. He asks if they would like him to release Jesus. Stirred up by the Jewish priests, they ask instead for the murderer and insurrectionist Barabbas. Pilate asks what he should do to Jesus. The crowd demands his execution. Pilate asks why he should do that, but the crowd is insistent. So he releases Barabbas to them, but orders Jesus crucified. This is a succinct and straightforward account. It is interesting to see how it gets changed by the later gospel writers. We've already seen the enormous changes made in later non-canonical accounts, such as the Gospel of Peter, but there are large changes already within the New Testament versions. The Gospel of Matthew almost certainly used Mark for its narrative, and in the account there are some significant differences, only two of which need to concern us here. First, in Matthew's version, during the trial, Pilate's wife sends him a message asking him to do nothing to Jesus because he's innocent. Second, and more striking, when Pilate realizes the crowd is going to riot if he does not accede to their demands, he calls for water and washes his hands, declaring that he is innocent of Jesus' blood. The crowd then cries out, "His blood be upon us and our children." Clearly, Matthew wants to emphasize even more than Mark that Pilate is not the one who wanted Jesus killed. It is the Jewish leaders and crowds that do. This emphasis comes to be even more pronounced in the Gospel of Luke, which also used Mark as its source. In this version, right off the bat, Pilate formally declares that he can find no crime in anything Jesus has done. But the chief priests and Jewish crowds continue to bring charges against him. Pilate then learns that Herod, king of Jesus' territory, Galilee, is in town for the Passover. He orders Jesus to be taken off to be tried by Herod. Herod questions Jesus, but ends up sending him back to Pilate, apparently not finding anything to charge him with either. When Jesus returns to Pilate, Pilate again declares him to be innocent 2 more times, but the Jewish crowd prevails, and so Pilate delivers Jesus up to their will. Here, it is a crystal clear account of who is ultimately at fault for the death of Jesus. It is not the Roman governor or the emperor or the empire he represents. They have found Jesus innocent. It is instead the Jewish authorities and the people they lead. In some ways, that message is magnified even more in our latest canonical account of John. John probably did not have access to the accounts of the synoptics, but in very broad outline, his version is similar. Jesus is brought to Pilate by the Jewish authorities, is questioned, and then ordered to be crucified. Beyond such basics, however, the account in John is very different indeed. In John's version, the Jewish leaders bring Jesus to Pilate's official place of business called the Praetorium. But they refuse to go inside because they do not want to be ritually defiled, which would make it impossible for them to eat the Passover meal that evening. John never indicates why going into the Praetorium would defile these Jews, but their refusal to enter involves two very odd differences from the other Gospels. For one thing, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the Passover meal had already been eaten the night before. In these earlier Gospels, Jesus appears before Pilate on the day after the Passover meal, but in John, it is instead the morning before the meal. Thus, John's account cannot represent an accurate memory if the synoptic version is historically accurate. The other oddity is that since the Jewish leaders will not go in to Pilate but simply send Jesus in, Pilate is put in the somewhat peculiar situation of having to go in and out of his own place of judgment to talk to the accusers and the accused. First, he talks to Jesus alone, then he goes out to talk to the Jewish leaders, then he goes back in, then he goes out, and so on. Pilate goes in and out 6 times. Another difference in John's account is that Jesus and Pilate have several extended conversations. Jesus is not silent before the accusations, as in the other accounts. Instead, he uses the charges brought against him to speak to Pilate about himself, his identity, his kingdom, and the truth. As in Luke, Pilate tries to release Jesus 3 times, but quote unquote, the Jews will not hear of it. They insist that Jesus be executed. Pilate finally brings Jesus outside and shows him to the Jews and tells them to behold your king. The Jews urge him to crucify Jesus. I wish I could have been in those crowds. I'd have been like, yeah, crucify that motherfucker. Who the fuck does he think he is? King of the what now? Yeah, eat my ass, Jesus. Crucify that bastard. I'd have been out there with a torch and shit, like, do it. I'd have been out there with some nails, like, can I do it? The fuck? Hell nah. Pilate tries to release Jesus 3 times, but the Jews will not hear of it. They insist that Jesus be executed. Pilate finally brings Jesus outside and shows him to the Jews and tells them to behold your king. The Jews urge him to crucify Jesus. Pilate asks whether they really want him to crucify their king, and the Jewish chief priests reply, we have no king but Caesar. Pilate then handed him over to them to be crucified. This is a stunning sentence. When it says, to them, whom does it mean? The closest grammatical antecedent is the chief priests. In this account, Pilate not only gives Jesus over to the will of the Jewish leaders and the people they represent, as in Luke, he also gives him over to them to be crucified. The Jewish authorities are literally responsible for Jesus' death. As we've seen, one indicator that an account may preserve a distorted memory is when it differs from another version of the same event in ways that cannot readily be reconciled. We should recall what we saw in chapter 1. When we remember the past, it is because of our present. What we experience in the present affects not only what we remember about the past, but also how we remember it. In light of that reality, what can we say about the present of the gospel writers producing their accounts of Jesus' trial some 4 or 6 decades after the fact? Is it possible that this present led them to distort the memories of what happened at Jesus' trial, whether consciously or unconsciously? This is an important question to ask, since in our study of memory, we are interested not only in the question of whether recollections of the past are historically accurate, but equally with what these recollections can tell us about the people having them and what they found important about the past when they represented it to themselves in their mental images of what happened. One thing we can say for certain is that in the context within which the gospel writers were producing their work, some 4 to 6 decades after Jesus' death, there were very real and serious tensions between the followers of Jesus, whether they were Jewish or Gentile, and non-Christian Jews. Most Jews, of course, rejected the claim that Jesus was the Messiah, as do I. Those few who did, credulous fools, those few who did come to believe that Jesus was the Messiah were insistent that this belief was absolutely right. Their opponents insisted that these views were wrong. Over time, these different opinions led to considerable animosity and ill feeling. Christians had difficulty understanding why non-Christian Jews didn't see the truth, why they rejected their own Messiah. They started claiming that Jews had always rejected their Messiah. Eventually, they claimed that it was because Jews rejected him that Jesus was turned over to the Roman authorities for punishment. Soon they maintained that, in fact, the reason Jesus died was because of the recalcitrant Jews. Eventually, they argued that, in fact, the Jews had killed Jesus. That was a distorted memory. The Jews did not kill Jesus. The Romans killed Jesus. Okay, let's get that straight. Okay, put that in your pipe and smoke it. That, of course, does not mean that anyone can blame all the Romans, you know what I mean? It was the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, who ordered him crucified. In addition, much of the detail of these accounts appears to involve distorted memories. I've already pointed out that John's recollection of when the event occurred cannot be reconciled with that in the synoptic gospels. One of them is necessarily a distorted memory. Even more interesting, why is it that with the passing of time, Pilate is shown to be more increasingly innocent in Jesus' death? The attempts to show his innocence differ from one gospel to the next, but as you line them up chronologically, Pilate becomes more and more exculpated in the decision that Jesus had to die. Historically, it would have been Pilate's own decision, pure and simple, probably on the basis of a very brief trial in which he decided that Jesus was a troublemaker. Later, some Christians began to claim that he washed his hands of the affair and declared Jesus not guilty. Somewhat later, he was explicitly said to have declared Jesus innocent 3 times, yet later he was recorded as handing Jesus over to Jewish chief priests themselves for execution. It's likely that these are not things that actually happened. Okay, these are distorted memories of what happened by later Christians in the throes of controversy with Jews over whether Jesus was really the Messiah. The memories are important for us then in showing the highly fraught context within which Jesus was being remembered by his later followers. They were not simply recalling facts of history, they were remembering the past in ways that were highly relevant to their present. The other way to isolate distorted memories is to consider their inherent plausibility. I will later be arguing that the entire Barabbas episode probably represents a distorted memory. Here, I want to mention just 3 other aspects of the accounts that seem highly implausible. The first is that when Jesus is brought to Pilate, Pilate asks the crowd whether he should find him guilty or not, and if guilty, what he should do with him. How are we to imagine that this is historical? What self-respecting judge would ask the people in the courtroom what they would like him to decide and what the sentence should be? None that I know of. Is there any record of any Roman official ever conducting a trial in this way? No. Was Pilate the kind of person who would simply do what his subjects wanted him to do? No. Is it likely that this is actually what happened? Well, probably no. For the second implausibility, I'll refer only to the Gospel of John. Is it really plausible that the powerful Roman governor will be running back and forth between the accuser and the accused so as not to offend their religious sensibilities? Not really. Can one think of a reason that the author of John's Gospel would want to set the scene like this, even though it's not plausible? Yes, because in John's gospel, the Jewish leaders do not want to enter the praetorium because it would prevent them from eating the Passover meal that evening. They desperately want to eat the Passover lamb. They also desperately want Jesus killed. But for the Gospel of John, who is Jesus? In John's Gospel, and only in John's Gospel, Jesus is called the Passover lamb. This is an account written to emphasize the incredible irony that the Jewish leaders reject precisely what they mostly want. Not only do they reject their own Messiah, they also reject their own Passover lamb while wanting to eat the lamb that evening. The memory is thus not just about what happened once in the life of Jesus. It also reflects the antagonism Christian storytellers had toward their Jewish opponents who maintained their Jewish practices and customs, yet rejected the claim that Jesus was the one sent from God for the salvation of the world. The third implausibility is again provided by the memory of the event in John's gospel. If John is right that Pilate repeatedly went outside to talk to the Jewish accusers to find out what the charges were, and then went inside to query Jesus about it in private, and that Jesus used these opportunities to launch into speeches about his person and identity, how exactly does John know what Jesus said on the occasion? It was just Jesus and Pilate talking alone. Immediately after, Jesus was led off to be crucified. So he didn't tell anyone. It is beyond belief that years later, Pilate recounted the episode to interested Christian interviewers. So, where did the words of Jesus recorded on the occasion come from? Someone must have invented them. They surely represent distorted memories. At the same time, there are valuable recollections of Jesus' words, recollections that make sense in light of later Christian understandings of Jesus. It is he, not Pilate or even Caesar, who is the ultimate ruler. It is he who is the king, even if his kingdom is not of this world. Now that I've established how one can go about determining what are probably fairly accurate gist memories and what appears to be distorted memories, I can take 5 other episodes in the gospel narratives and explain in relatively short order why I think they represent distorted memories. Memories that may not be accurate to what actually transpired in history, but are important nonetheless for what they can tell us to those who remembered Jesus in these ways and told their stories to others. The triumphal entry. There seems to be no reason to doubt that Jesus spent the last week of his life in Jerusalem, looking ahead to the celebration of the Passover feast. Passover was by far the busiest time of the year in Jerusalem, when the city would swell many times its normal size as Jewish pilgrims from around the world would come to enjoy the feast in the capital city. They would normally arrive a week early to prepare for the big day. The festival was and is celebrated to commemorate the exodus of the children of Israel from their slavery in Egypt during the days of Moses, more than a millennium before the birth of Jesus. The historical basis for the feast is given in the book of Exodus. There we are told that the people of Israel had been in Egypt for centuries and had been enslaved there. God, though, heard their cries of despair and sent a great leader, Moses, who, through his miracle working power, brought the Israelites, well over 1 million of them, out from their slavery and eventually brought them to the promised land. Jewish people throughout the world have celebrated this great Exodus event, in some respects, the founding event for the people of Israel once a year at Passover. Since the festive meal in the days of Jesus was to involve eating a sacrificed lamb, the only place on earth to celebrate it properly was in Jerusalem, as it was only there in the temple that animal sacrifices could be made to God. And so those who had the time and money to do so would come to Jerusalem for the feast. It would be a mistake, though, to think that most Jews in Palestine were celebrating this feast out of purely antiquarian interests, to recall what God had once done many centuries before in freeing his people from the bondage of a foreign oppressor. In the first century, Israel was once again subject to another power, this time not Egypt, but Rome. Many Jews surely anticipated that as God had acted on behalf of his people in the past, so he would do once more in the future, liberating his oppressed people from the tyranny of a foreign power. The Roman rulers of Palestine understood full well that this time of year was especially incendiary. Not only were there large crowds of Jews in Jerusalem, but also some of those crowds were eager to drive the Romans out of the promised land, or to have God do so. The Roman governor, in this case Pontius Pilate, normally stayed at his palatial residence on the Mediterranean coast in Caesarea, but Passover was one time of the year when he would come to stay in Jerusalem along with his troops, whom he would station around the city to quell any problems that arose, to squelch any riots before they got out of hand. This is the historical reality of Passover. In about the year 30 CE, when Jesus and a group of his followers came to the city along with thousands of other pilgrims for the festival. That reality itself should call into question the memory of how Jesus arrived in town in the episode known throughout Christian history as the triumphal entry. In our earliest version, found now in Mark 11, as Jesus and his disciples draw near to the walls of Jerusalem, he sends 2 of them into a village to procure for him a colt on which he can ride into town. They do so, and Jesus comes into Jerusalem to the acclamation of the gathered crowds. Some throw garments on the road for him to ride over, others cut leafy branches from the fields. The throng of people both before and behind him acclaim Jesus to be the new king, who has come to restore the kingdom of David to his people. Quote, and they were crying out, Hosanna! Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the kingdom of our father David that is coming. Hosanna is the highest. That's from Mark 11, verses 9 and 10. Matthew has an intriguing variation of this memory of Jesus' entry into Jerusalem. According to Matthew, Jesus' ride into town was a fulfillment of Scripture. Quote, this took place in order to fulfill what was spoken by the prophet who said, speak to the daughter of Zion. Behold, the king is coming to you, humble and seated on a donkey, and upon a colt, the foal of an ass. This is a quotation of the Jewish scripture. According to Matthew, Jesus fulfilled the scripture in an oddly literal way. As is commonly known in ancient Hebrew poetry, poetic lines were coupled not by rhyming schemes, as with some English poetry, but by various kinds of conceptual parallelisms. In a two-line sequence, a couplet, the first line might say something, and the next line might say the same thing in other words, or it might repeat part of the first line with an additional thought, or it might express the opposite side of the same coin. There were several ways by which such poetry could work, but it was poetry, not straightforward descriptive prose. The line from Zechariah about being seated on a donkey upon a colt, the foal of an ass, was the first kind of parallelism I just mentioned, where the second part, a colt, the foal of an ass, is saying the same thing as the first part, a donkey, only in other words. Matthew apparently didn't understand how the parallelism worked. He took it literally. For him, scripture predicted that there was to be both a donkey and a colt. As a result, in his version, Jesus tells his disciples to secure two animals. So they do. And Jesus rides into down, straddling them. Into down? I just found a typo. He meant to say into town. How do you even make that mistake? The D is typed with your middle finger on the left hand, and the T is typed with the pointer finger on the left hand. That's not even the same finger. Like, how do you make that mistake? Anyway. And Jesus rides into town. Excuse me. You meant to say town, and you put down. Down in this context doesn't make any fucking sense, Bart. I'm gonna need you to do better. Okay? It is needless to say a very peculiar memory of the event. But in the event itself, is it an accurate memory? Was there really a triumphal entry? The very broadest gist of the memory is no doubt true. Jesus must have come into Jerusalem one way or another, but the Gospel's description of the event is highly implausible, and precisely for the reasons I started with. The Roman authorities were particularly keen to prevent any disturbances during the days leading up to Passover, arguably the most incendiary time of the entire calendar year. In the Gospel accounts, the Jewish crowds cry out that Jesus is the one who is about to bring the kingdom of David to his people. How can a Davidic kingdom be set up in Jerusalem? Only if the current rulers are thrown out. That's how. Who would be the leader of that Davidic kingdom? Obviously a Davidic king. The crowd in these gospel accounts are claiming Jesus to be the coming Messiah who will overthrow the Roman forces who are occupying the city and the land. Roman soldiers would have been stationed around the city. How can we believe that this wild celebration of their future conqueror would not make them sit up, take notice, and act accordingly? If the throngs were really proclaiming Jesus as the coming Messiah in his glorious and heralded entry into the city, how is it that he was not arrested on sight and taken out of the way precisely to prevent some kind of riot or mob uprising? I find it completely implausible. I think this must be a distorted memory. Why would later Christian storytellers remember an event like this in a way that probably didn't actually happen? The reason is not hard to find. We need to recall that in the decades after Jesus' death, before the Gospels were written, Christians were often in an antagonistic relationship with non Christian Jews, often blaming the Jews for being a fickle people who rejected their own God and who never understood his plan to save the world. The story of Jesus' triumphal entry embodies that view. Here, the Jewish crowds are portrayed as ecstatic that their future king, the Messiah, has arrived, and they proclaim him blessed on his coming into the holy city. They expect that he will now establish God's kingdom on earth with his throne in Jerusalem. But it is precisely these same people who several days later reject Jesus calling for his crucifixion. Why did the Jewish people turn on Jesus? For these storytellers, it is because the Jewish people have always turned on God and his prophets. They are an unfaithful people, ultimately opposed to God rather than on his side. And they are a fickle people, hot at one time, cold at another. So wishy-washy, in other words. And they are a fickle people, hot at one time, cold at another, claiming God's Messiah at one moment and then calling for his blood the next. Jesus wasn't the king that Jews were expecting. When he came into Jerusalem, he did not start a rebellion to have himself installed as king. He preached against a sinful people, telling them to repent and again their leaders, arousing their anger. And so, not understanding God's plan of salvation, the Jews of Jerusalem flat out rejected Jesus for not being the Messiah they wanted, and they demanded his crucifixion. For Christian storytellers, that's how Jews have always treated God and his prophets. The memory of Jesus, then, is as much about the conflicts that later Christians were having with their Jewish opponents who rejected Jesus as it is about what actually happened in Jesus' life itself. The cleansing of the temple. Oh, this is one of my favorite stories. The Gospel of Matthew, Mark, and Luke agree that when Jesus arrived in Jerusalem, he went into the temple and made a disturbance there, to say the least. In our earliest account, Mark, we are told that he drove out those who were selling and buying in the temple, overturned the tables of those who were exchanging money and the chairs of those selling doves, and did not, quote, allow anyone to carry anything throughout the temple. He then declared from a passage of scripture that the temple was to be, quote, a house of prayer for all the nations, end quote, but that they had made it, quote, a cave of thieves, end quote. This irritated the Jewish chief priests and scribes, who began to look for a way to destroy him. But, quote, the multitude, end quote, was astonished at his teaching. To understand this passage, it's necessary to know the context. Who's selling animals? Who's exchanging money? And why? People coming to Jerusalem from long distances would not be able to bring their sacrificial animals with them. So to make it possible for Jews to sacrifice in accordance with the laws of Moses, it was necessary to have animals for sale on site at the temple. But it was not acceptable that Roman currency be used to purchase these animals. Roman coins had an image of the emperor on them, and he was considered a divine being in parts of the world. Images themselves were not allowed in the holy city. Coins dedicated to a foreign god were strictly forbidden. So there needed to be a currency exchange, in which Roman currency could be exchanged for temple coins, which had no human images on them. All of this sounds so sensible that it's difficult to see why Jesus would have found it objectionable. Surely he didn't object to sacrificing animals. This was commanded by the word of God in the law of Moses. And there had to be a way of acquiring animals. It made sense that one could not use Roman coinage to do it. So what was the problem? The only hint comes in the text itself. Jesus appears to have thought that the commerce in the temple made it a cave of thieves. Did he mean that it was completely unacceptable for people to be making money off the temple sacrificial system? That somehow the system had grown corrupt and had to be replaced? We do know of other Jews from Jesus' day who thought the temple was a corrupt place that was going to be destroyed by God. Other apocalyptically minded Jews who opposed the priests and those who sided with them in their worship at the temple. So possibly that's what Jesus had in mind. Scholars often maintain that this attack on the temple, if that's how it's to be understood, makes best sense within the context of Jesus' broader message, that destruction was soon to arrive with the coming of a cosmic judge from heaven, the Son of Man, and that those who would be destroyed would not only be the enemies of Israel, but also many people within Israel itself. If this view is correct, then possibly the disturbance in the temple was meant as a kind of enacted parable, where Jesus was acting out a kind of physical demonstration of his message, that a full-scale destruction was soon to come. If so, then as I earlier indicated, it makes sense that there's a gist memory here that is historically right, that Jesus did make some kind of disturbance in the temple that led to his opposition by the Jewish authorities, eventuating in his death. But could it have happened as narrated? 2 points should be made here. The first is that the Gospel of John also has an account of this episode with strikingly different details. For example, there we're told that Jesus made a whip and used it to drive out those selling animals and the money changers. That sounds even more violent, especially for those who think of Jesus as a pacifist. What is yet more striking is that even though the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, placed the episode in the last week of Jesus' life, the Gospel of John places it at the very beginning. There it happens in chapter 2, one of the very first things Jesus does in his public ministry of more than 2 years. How could John be right if the synoptics are right? Are we really supposed to think that Jesus did the same thing twice? Moreover, if he did it at the beginning of his ministry, why wasn't he arrested and brought up on charges then? In light of this question, how do we even explain the account in the synoptics? In their version, Jesus is not arrested on the spot. He spends another week in Jerusalem before he's tracked down. Why would that be? If Jesus made this big a disturbance in such a dangerous time, precisely in the place where most soldiers would have been located, surely he would have been seized and taken off immediately. It should be stressed that for Mark, this was indeed a very big disturbance. In fact, it was impossibly big. Mark indicates that Jesus did not allow anyone to carry anything throughout the temple. It's important to realize that the temple sacrificial system simply could not function if priests and their assistants were prevented from carrying anything: sacrificial knives, bowls to catch the animal's blood, the carcasses themselves, and so on. Mark is saying that Jesus shut down the entire temple cult by himself. Is this plausible? Probably. From watching too many Hollywood versions, many of us think of the temple facility as about the size of a large house. In fact, the temple was enormous. The space within the temple walls was large enough to accommodate 25 American football fields. How are we to imagine that Jesus shut down the entire operation? It seems completely implausible. And implausible that if he had did so, he was not arrested and put away. What the fuck is going on here? Even though there may be a valid just memory behind these accounts, the versions as narrated in the Gospels appear to represent distorted memories. But that doesn't mean that we should simply discount these memories and throw them out in the trash heap of historical inaccuracies. They can again tell us a lot about the people who cherished such recollections and sought to share them with others. The Christian storytellers who passed along the traditions of Jesus' actions in the temple were trying to emphasize something that was very important to them. True religion, for them, is not a matter of outward form and conformity to established ritual. It's a matter of the heart. When Jesus engaged in his act at the temple, it was, on the one hand, an attack on the old Jewish religion that he had surpassed. God no longer dwelled in the temple of the Jews. Jesus came to indicate that God had established a new order based on Jesus' own words and actions, not on the Jewish sacrificial cult. On the other hand, this memory of Jesus' cleansing of the temple served to emphasize that Jesus changed the worship of God in an even deeper and more profound sense. Worshiping God is not a matter of outward form, conforming to set rituals and established cultic practices. God can be found not in human buildings, institutions, and rites, but in the act of prayer, which is open to everyone, Jew and Gentile. God, in fact, can be found among all those who follow Jesus in cleansing their religion of outward show and ceremony, and in seeking God with a pure heart. Anyway, in all four Gospels, at least one of Jesus' followers is armed when he is arrested. In the Synoptic Gospels, this unnamed follower draws his sword and strikes the slave of the high priest, cutting off his ear. Jesus puts a halt to his follower's violent inclination, however, and humbly submits to his arrest. In Luke's version, he does so only after healing the ear. From the 18th century until the present day, there have been scholars and non-scholars who have thought that this incident in the garden is both altogether plausible and indicative of the character of Jesus' message and mission. In this opinion, the incident must be historical for a rather simple reason. What later Christian would make up such a story? When Christians were telling and retelling their accounts of Jesus' life in the years after his death, of course they would want him to appear entirely palatable to their audiences. Nothing would make Jesus more palatable to Roman eyes than the view that he was a peace loving promoter of nonviolence, not a violent insurrectionist against Rome. If Jesus allowed his followers to be armed, however, that would suggest he was in favor of them carrying out acts of violence. If later Christians would not make up the idea that Jesus promoted violence, then no one could make up the idea that his followers were armed. Following this logic, the story of the sword in the garden is not an invented tradition, but a historical fact. Jesus' followers, therefore, were armed. Moreover, if they were armed, so this reasoning goes, then Jesus must have anticipated and even promoted an armed rebellion. There's a good deal of sense to this view, and it's easy to see why it's attractive. Still, at the end of the day, I don't find it convincing for two reasons. One, it's obvious, but ultimately unpersuasive. And the other that is less obvious, but absolutely compelling. The obvious objection is that throughout all of our traditions, Jesus is regularly and consistently portrayed as a teacher of nonviolence. Love your neighbor as yourself. Love your enemies. Love those who persecute you. Blessed are the peacemakers. Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. The one who lives by the sword will die by the sword. Throughout independent accounts of Jesus' life, he is shown to promote loving and submissive nonviolence. Doesn't that squelch the possibility that Jesus favored armed rebellion and that his followers were armed? The reason that argument is not totally persuasive is that Christians may have wanted to portray Jesus as nonviolent and remembered him as nonviolent for reasons of their own. Christians themselves were often opposed by the authorities and would have wanted to stress that they were no threat and no danger. In their own defense, they argued that they were peace-loving people, but how could they really be peace-loving if they worshiped and strove to emulate a person crucified for insurrection against the state? The Christian response could have been to emphasize that Jesus' execution was a complete miscarriage of justice. In this view, he was a peace-loving rabbi who urged a pacifist message of nonviolence. In theory, the Christians could have put this message extensively on his lips. Still, the abundant number of such pacifist statements on the lips of Jesus should give us pause and make us suspect that they might well represent accurate memories of his teachings, especially in light of the second reason for thinking that Jesus' followers did not put up an armed defense of him when the crowd came to arrest him. I think this reason is obviously and absolutely compelling. If Jesus' followers tried to defend him with a sword, or more than one sword, why weren't they arrested as well? If, if the problem with Jesus is that he was about to lead an armed rebellion, then surely his followers would have been as much of a threat as he, especially if they start whacking away at people's ears with their swords. I don't think Jesus' followers were armed in the garden when Jesus was arrested. Why then do we have discussions of the followers' swords in the various gospel accounts? My sense is that the sword attack is a story that was invented by an early Christian, either consciously created or simply generated as someone happened to tell the story and unconsciously elaborated it, who was trying to illustrate Jesus' teaching that the one who lives by the sword will die by the sword. This view will require a short explanation. Many of Jesus' best sayings in the Gospels may indeed go back to him. Quote, Sabbath was made for humans, not humans for the Sabbath. Those who are well have no need of a physician, but only those who are sick. A prophet is not without honor except in his own country. A large number of these great one-liners are delivered at the end of stories for which the sayings are particularly apt. It has long been recognized that, as happens even in modern contexts, sometimes a story will be told to set the stage for the delivery of a great climactic statement. I think that may have happened in the case of the story of the sword in the garden. Originally, there was a saying, possibly something Jesus actually said, about swords and not wielding them. The one who lives by the sword will die by the sword. As that saying was rehearsed over the years, there emerged a story that illustrated the point that Jesus' followers should not arm themselves with swords. This story was retold until it became the gospel account that someone wrongly used the sword, to attack Jesus' enemies. By way of contrast, Jesus himself passively submitted to being arrested. If I'm right, then the sword fight in the garden is a distorted memory. If it were an accurate memory, it's very hard to see why the disciples were not arrested. The reason why the event was later remembered in a way that was not historical is deeply significant. Later, Christian storytellers wanted to emphasize that even though they worshipped one who had been crucified for crimes against Rome, he decidedly did not urge a political rebellion. Moreover, they themselves did not oppose the ruling authorities. They did not believe in violence against those in charge. They did not believe in taking up arms in opposition to the state. During Jesus' life, some. Hold up. Well, if Jesus' followers didn't believe in taking up arms, they didn't believe in violence against those in charge, and they didn't believe in taking up arms in opposition to the state, then what the fuck are Christian nationalists doing? What the fuck is MAGA doing? Like, if Jesus and his followers wouldn't put up an armed rebellion, wouldn't arm themselves, wouldn't try to like overthrow what they consider to be a illegitimate government, then why would MAGA do it? Why would Christian nationalists do it? I'll tell you why. And I've said it many times. Because Christians don't give a shit what Jesus said or did. Okay? They don't give a fuck. They just use him as a cover, as a reason to judge you. Okay? But they're not. It's Jesus's words are for thee, but not for me when it comes to Christians. I'll just reread that little part. The reason why the event was later remembered in a way that was not historical is deeply significant. Later, Christian storytellers wanted to emphasize that even though they worshipped one who had been crucified for crimes against Rome, he decidedly did not urge a political rebellion. Moreover, they themselves did not oppose the ruling authorities. They did not believe in violence against those in charge. They did not believe in taking up arms in opposition to the state. Well, in that case, they couldn't have been communists. So there goes that whole Jesus was a communist thing. I mean, if you really believe that, then you can't be a communist, because communists, man, we about that life. We about taking up arms and overthrowing the state. So that would mean you need to have arms. Okay, so nowadays that means a motherfucking weapon. So I don't know what to tell you. I'm for the Second Amendment. You know what I mean? I'm not like just have any gun you want, you know. But I mean, as a communist, as a Marxist, you know, who realizes that it might have to come down to a violent overthrow to take away these powers from these rich sons of bitches. So in order to do so, you're going to need to be armed. So there's no such maybe only liberals think we don't need guns or some shit, but so I don't fuck with liberals. But anyway, although I will need liberals to align with my side, okay? Because communists just want what you want, you know? We just want you to have a life of freedom and make more money and be able to provide for your family. You know what I mean? We want all the things that the American dream lied to you about acquiring. Okay, they told you could get it through meritocracy, and that itself was a lie. So, but communists, we want that. We want to give you that for real. You know what I'm saying? We don't want your everyday to be just a slave to some capitalist overlords who do whatever they will with profits. No, sir. We want you to decide what you all do with the profits you make, you know, and how much of those profits go to who, you know. Why should it be decided by someone who doesn't do the job? It should be decided by you. You know what I mean? See, communist rhetoric is popular with the people, as long as you don't call it communist rhetoric, because then they'll be like, oh, wait, hold on. You know, but it's like, no, you agree with me. You want the same things I want. You just don't want the label that's attached to it. But that's what I'm trying to do. What's one of the things I'm trying to do? Trying to get people to see that communism isn't the bad guy. Okay. It was always the establishment. It was always big government that told you that communism was bad. Because the government always lies to you. Okay? They can't have you thinking communism's good, because then if you like look into communism and see what communism actually espouses, you'll be like, oh, wait, hold on. I think I want that. Because this capitalism bullshit is garbage. Like, we can keep the best parts of capitalism and get rid of the horrible parts. And that's essentially what I think 21st century communism would look like. It's essentially all the best parts of capitalism and getting rid of all the garbage parts. You know what I mean? So, which then would effectively, like, you would no longer see billionaires. Like, billionaires could not amass. Like, it's not possible because we're paying people livable wages. Yeah, you know what I mean? People can afford to do shit. They can afford to buy things. They can actually, be paid according to their labor. You know what I mean? Like right now, you go to Walmart, you get a job, stocking shelves or whatever. That job pays X amount of dollars. Let's say I also come in, I also get that job, making that same wage, but I come in early, I stay late, I work harder than you. Everyone knows it. I go to ask for a raise. You think they're going to give me a raise? Because that's how it works, right? Meritocracy, you work hard, you show yourself, and you get a raise. That is not at all how it works. What's going to happen is if they agree that, yeah, you've been coming in early, you've been staying late, you've been doing a wonderful job, everyone agrees. How about becoming a manager, a supervisor of some sort? That is not a raise. Okay. That's just another job position for which you may not even be qualified. Okay. But they're just like, well, if you want more money, you're going to have to do something else because we're not going to pay you more money to do that job. You know what I mean? They look at what that job pays, not what you are worth in that job. You know what I mean? So, and I only use Walmart as an example because I was that guy. Okay. I was killing it in OGP. Everyone in the district knew it. Okay. But they weren't gonna give me no raise. They was like, "Oh, we can make you a supervisor or something." I'm like, "I don't want to be a supervisor. Okay, I don't have the skills of a supervisor. I'm not good at managing people or nothing like that. You know what I'm saying? I like to be on the ground. I want to be picking the shell because I do a great job at it. Why can't I just be adequately compensated for doing such an excellent job?" Because that's not how it fucking works, because meritocracy is a lie. Okay. But in communism, I would have been paid adequately. Okay. Me and you would have got that same job, but you just do a mediocre job. So you keep your wage. But then they see I do an excellent job. So I make more money doing that same job, which is just more uh, uh, just gives it's just more of a reason. I can't think of the word, but it's just more of a reason to continue doing that job excellently because now you know there's some incentive to do the job well. You know what I mean? And then they'll give you another raise and another raise and another raise because that's how it should work. But that's not how it works. Okay. But if they see you're doing a good job, they just want to give you more responsibilities. Okay. In a position, again, for which you may not even be qualified, but that's the only way they can justify giving you more money. You got to do more work for them. Even Louis agrees. I know you heard him because that's how it works. So. Anywho, where were we? Here. This view will require a short explanation. Many of Jesus' best sayings in the gospel may have gone back to him. Yeah, we already saw that. I think this may have happened in the case of the story of the sword in the garden. We already read that. Where are we at? Oh, okay. Okay. Where are we at? We're at the Barabbas episode, but I'm gonna just pause it there. I'm gonna just pause it there. We read quite a oh, okay. We read quite a bit today. But I'm what did I just do though? I mean, wow, it's so sour. I love Tabasco though, but that wasn't the move. Louis, Louis, you up there? Louis. It's the book. Bart Ehrman, Jesus Before the Gospels. Um, yeah. What's up, Jiffy Lube? What's up, Carla? What's up, everybody, man? But I'm about to get off. Thanks for moderating, and thanks for tuning in. Hope y'all learned a thing or two. We'll do this again. I don't know, tomorrow or some shit. I'll make the. I'll post. I'll make a post saying when I'll go live again, so y'all can know it ahead of time. Cause I just be doing this shit just willy nilly. Just I'm going live right now, so it doesn't really give people an opportunity to like prepare. So I'll leave a message in the like as a post, like my polls and shit. I'll leave it there. In the meantime, fuck your God.